our program, please, by asking everyone to rise for the Pledge of Allegiance, and Jim Ramsey will come forward and lead us in the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Thanks to Starbucks for donating our delicious coffee, which really anchors our period of fellowship before the meeting. Thanks to the volunteers who brought baked goods, and thanks to those who put some money in the basket, because donations that you make this month assure that there will be cookies and cake next month. I would like to introduce an old friend of ours, Sophia Ho, who will just come up for a few moments. Once again, in connection with Martin Luther King Day, which will be next month, our town is going to support our veterans who live at the Bedford Green Apartments. And Sophia is once again leading that effort. And we can help. And Sophia will tell us just how we can help. Sophia.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. You're so kind to allow me to say a few words. Every year, for 6 years, our town has the Martin Luther King Day of Service Committee. In the past, we have all kinds of services for older people, younger people, and the people in between. And me and my couple of friends are sort of working on the senior events. Since last year, we decided we're going to have a senior gathering, a party with a couple of speakers, and young musicians, and junior high student essay contest winners to come to talk to us. It will take place at Brookhaven. We are asking our guests to bring an item. Last year, I suggest Bedford Green because I feel we cannot do enough for our veterans. These are the formerly homeless people, and now they have a place to live. And so this year, again, I suggest we still collect things for them, from paper towels, shaving creams, dishwashing liquid, anything household they all needed. Last year, we were lucky. Lexington people are very generous. Last year, we collected $500 in checks and estimate about $500 of goods, and we deliver to them. They are very appreciative. So this year, Martin Luther King Day will be on January 21st, 19, and will take place in Brookhaven. I brought some flyers, and I know Linda said that in January she can send out the same thing via email. So I brought some, and please take a look, take a sheet, and I hope you will join us. Thank you very much. Thank you, Linda.
So we can do a little more than that. If what we'd like is for as many of you as possible to come to Brookhaven on the afternoon of Martin Luther King Day and enjoy the program that Sophia has put together. It's really quite charming because a lot of the Lexington school children are featured in the program. They provide musical performances and essays. It's very nice. But if you cannot attend that, please consider at our next meeting, which is January 14th, bringing a bag of goodies, household, and anything that you need to run a household, as Sophia said. You know, dishwashing liquid, sponges, paper towels, or personal grooming items, such as deodorant or soap or anything, toothpaste. Bring it to our meeting, drop it off here on January 14, and we will find a way to get it to Sophia, who will find a way to bring it over to the veterans at Bedford Green. And we'll send you all an email reminder with our January program. So let's see if we can top what we did last year. Thank you, Sophia. Speaking of veterans at the Bedford VA, we always have a blue box over at that table where we deposit magazines and calendars and note cards, and Pat Costello is the keeper of the box, and she's the one who brings it over to Bedford. She would just like to make a quick announcement regarding the items that are really desirable to be donated. Pat.
Thank you. I just noticed that there are a couple of magazines that are from like Newsweek or The Week, and unfortunately, those, by the time they get to read these things are out of date. So I'm going to ask that you do not bring in any magazines that are over, say, 2 months old. National Geographic is wonderful, and maybe 6 months worth of National Geo, but please, the ones that are dated from 1940s, you can keep. Thank you.
Okay, you get the hint. Thank you, Pat. And just one more announcement. If you were here at our last month's program, Carolyn Kingston and Tony Tasker talked about tracing their grandfather's journey to France. Their grandfathers were both soldiers in World War I. And the grandfather of one of them, Major Cole, eventually had a destroyer. Was it named? Yes, a destroyer named after him. And one of our audience members, Peter Lund, United States Navy, retired, was very fascinated by this whole family tie, and he did some research on the USS Cole. And just as a very quick follow-up to the story of Major Cole, who died at the Battle of Belleau Wood, we thought we would kind of close the loop. Peter, you want to come up and just talk very briefly about what you found about the USS Cole?
Well, the quickie thing is we all know about the current USS Cole, who was, or she was attacked by Al-Qaeda terrorists in Yemen in October of 2000. That USS Cole is no relation to the USS Cole that we were talking about from World War I. The current USS Cole was named for a staff sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps, and as everybody knows, U.S. Navy destroyers are named for Naval or Marine Corps heroes. So obviously this guy was a hero probably during World War II. The USS Cole, named after the grandfather, was DD-155, and she was launched in 1919 in Philadelphia, and she was commissioned on the 19th of June. And following her commissioning, she sailed Turkish waters and aided in the evacuation of refugees who were fleeing the turmoil and the wars in the Middle East. During the 20s and into the 30s, she was commissioned, decommissioned, recommissioned, decommissioned, and finally recommissioned roughly in June of 1941, and was made 28 voyages escorting convoys to Newfoundland and Iceland. And if we think back to that period of time, was when Churchill and Roosevelt cut the deal that U.S. destroyers would escort British convoys as far as Newfoundland or Iceland. So that's what she did in the early part of the war, and even before the war. July 43, she took part in the invasion of Sicily, returned to the U.S. and did more convoy duty along the East Coast. She was decommissioned for the final time in November of 1946 and was sold for scrap, I assume, in October of 1947. So we may just be shaving with her razor blades because Gillette brought a lot of old, old destroyers.
Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Thank you, Peter. That's interesting follow-up. All right, does anyone have any other announcement that you would like to share that would be of interest to our group? Always like to make sure. Okay. With that, let us move on to our program, and let me introduce our speaker, Commander John Cole. John Cole is the executive officer of Base Boston, overseeing more than 500 active duty, reserve, and civilian personnel across the 1st Coast Guard District, which stretches from New York City to the Canadian border. Their job is to provide mission and logistics support to cutters, sectors, air stations, and small boat stations throughout the district. John enlisted in 1984, intending to stay for 4 years, get a college degree, and move on, but discovered to his surprise that he had found his niche. For the first half of his career, he worked in operational communications support. As an officer and a commander, he specialized in information technology, managing a nationwide web of computers and IT systems while meeting all Department of Defense and Homeland Security cybersecurity mandates. He earned a bachelor's degree in computer systems from the University of Maryland and a master's in information technology management from Brandeis. The Homeland Security Act of 2002 formally assigned the Coast Guard 11 missions. They keep our ports and harbors safe, they rescue downed boats and sailors, protect our delicate ecosystems and marine environments, promote boating safety and pleasure, prevent drugs from entering the country, steer ships away from icebergs, and much, much more. So, here to tell us that much, much more is Commander John Cole.
Good morning, everyone. Can you guys hear me all right? This is my first time wearing one of these mics. I feel kind of cool. At exactly 9:05 in the morning, on April 17th, 1989, my Morse code operator, Petty Officer 3rd Class Phil Moran, yelled to me across the din of the various communication systems employed at ComState Boston. Petty Officer Cole, he said, I had copied a distress call. My heart quickened as I ran over to the booth. What do you have, Phil? I got a ship's call sign in her position. She's sinking, and the crew is abandoning ship. I stood there for a second, looking from Phil to the radio, back to Phil. Who is she? I looked it up, he said. It's the Star of Alexandria. Ask her to repeat so we can confirm the position. I did. She's not responding. I immediately contacted my communications watch officer, and together we notified the offices in Atlantic area. By that evening, we had 5 Navy and Coast Guard search and rescue planes looking for survivors. While that was happening, we sent a Mayday relay via our Morse code broadcast system to let other mariners in the area know that the ship was in distress. We were fortunate to pick up the 950-foot Ravenscraig, a tanker, who we diverted to assist. For the next few hours, we made numerous phone calls and communicated with Coast Guard and civilian ships to help guide them to the last known position of the Star of Alexandria. The ship was more than 400 miles southeast of Cape Cod. The winds were whipping and the water was ice cold. The motor vessel Star of Alexandria sent a single SOS on 500 kilohertz, the Morse code international distress frequency. Within seconds of sending that single message, her 652-foot frame cracked in two. She sank to the bottom of the Atlantic in minutes. As I left watch that night, I wondered if the crew had time to launch life rafts. I also prayed that we copied the ship's position correctly. Good morning, everyone. Wanted to get you started with that, and trust me, there is an ending to the story, and we'll get to that a little bit later. So, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me here to Lexington. I've been working with Dave Treff now for almost a year. I think there were some scheduling difficulties getting me in, but here I am finally, and I'm standing over there, and Linda, thank you very much, is giving me this great introduction. I'm hearing some of the stories, right? The Navy folks, Coast Guard folks, and I'm thinking, man, this is going to be a tough crowd because this is where the history is. You know, if I were to write down all this stuff, man, I could probably make hundreds of dollars. Hundreds of dollars in the stories and stuff. But I want to say thank you very much. This is very important to me. I'm very, very proud to be here today, not only representing the Coast Guard, but representing my family, which is really are the military members, past, present, and future. So thank you very much. Special note to my wife, Christine. She's our unit, our ombudsman. She was nice enough to come here with me today. And she's going to look me in the eye periodically to make sure I'm saying the right thing and I'm not talking too much. Good luck with that. Now this picture up here, this is the introductory slide. This is one of our 270-foot Coast Guard cutters. She's a Boston-based cutter, Coast Guard cutter Escanaba. The Escanaba itself has a very long history. But speaking of history, let's talk a little bit about me real quick. I think a lot of it, Linda, you covered in the bio, but let me just show you over the last 34 years of Coast Guard service some of the different places I've been. I was talking with these folks here earlier today, and I couldn't help but notice when we were having the conversation, the question came up about the Boston area, and I got to thinking about it, and my whole career has been flip-flopping between coasts. I'm originally from Buffalo, New York, on the Great Lakes. I know, isn't that terrible? But I started off in Cape May, New Jersey, and immediately went to radioman school. Now that's a rating in the Coast Guard that no longer exists, right? One of the things we learned was Morse code, and yes, I do remember my Morse code. Does anybody here know Morse code? Awesome. From school in California, I had my first and only cutter, the Coast Guard cutter Morgenthau, 378-foot high-endurance cutter based out of California. And we do have a Hamilton sailor here. Where are you at? There you are, another 378-foot Coast Guard cutter. Those ships are virtually all gone now. They've been replaced with more technologically advanced ships. And I don't know if Morgenthau was one of them, but a lot of them are being sold to the Bangladesh Navy and places like that. Those countries get these ships, they break down, and who do they call to have them fix it? Coast Guard, we go to Bangladesh, we'll go to the Philippines, and we'll fix their ships. From the Morgenthau, I spent some time in Boston, got to go to Buffalo, which is great. Not really. Got my degree, back to Alameda, back to Boston. Got a Honolulu trip out of the deal, which was great. There's some great stories out of Honolulu. If you've never been there, Coast Guard-wise, they do a lot of unique missions in Honolulu. We'll talk a little bit about the mission sets in a little bit. And then from there, back to Alameda again, and finally here I am back in Boston. Where I go from here, I don't know. I'm sure it'll be wonderful just like the rest of my career. So, I mentioned earlier with all the history in this room, now I could probably talk for hours on Coast Guard history, but we only have a little bit of time today, so I wanted to give you a real quick rundown of where we came from. Before I do that though, I want to mention the 1775 date. Up here, Continental Navy established. Does that date sound familiar to any of you Lexington residents? Right. Now the statue that sits out back, raise your hand if you know who that is, or who you think that you know that is. Let's see, where are we? Right here. Where's the front of the building? It's the one that's right in the square there. The blue statue that's out there. The Minuteman? Yeah. Who is that? Captain Parker. Right. Captain John Parker, who happens to be my first cousin 9 times removed. Now, was that a coincidence or what? What are the odds of that? Right? But 1775, that's when the Continental Navy was established, and by 1783, at the end of Revolutionary War, it stopped. Now, for that part of early naval history, it was a Navy with a lowercase n. It wasn't the actual U.S. Navy, because the U.S. Navy was established in 1797. How many Navy folks in the audience? Yeah, the Coast Guard is actually a longer seagoing service than you, so don't throw anything at me, but the fact of the matter is that's just how that turned out. Matter of fact, the Coast Guard, way back in the beginning since 1790, was the only armed maritime service in the United States. That was the Revenue Marine, which was the precursor to today's U.S. Coast Guard. The Harriet Lane, revenue cutter, Civil War, fired the first shots of the Civil War at sea. Okay. 1894, they renamed the Revenue Marine to the Revenue Cutter Service. Do you guys know who created the Coast Guard? Yeah, it's on your $10 bill, which I'd be happy to take up here when you're ready. Matter of fact, yeah, Alexander Hamilton was the Secretary of Treasury at the time that put forth this idea that we had to have some method as a new country to keep those privateers and pirates and all these other folks from affecting our trade routes. So he was the one that had this great idea to get that going in 1790. On August 4th, it was signed into law that the U.S. Coast Guard, the Revenue Marine would be established. Move along a little bit, 1912, the Titanic. And Linda, you mentioned a little bit about that when we were looking at that. When the Titanic sank in April of 1912, there was no method for any of these ships other than having lookouts to find out whether or not there were icebergs in the area, because that was a very heavily transited lane, not only for passenger ships but other vessels as well. And because of the unsinkable Titanic sinking there in the North Atlantic, the Coast Guard was charged with monitoring ice in that area. And the wonderful thing in 1913, when it was established, and to this day present, we've had no ships sinking because of ice. But it was because of the Titanic that the Coast Guard was charged with that mission. Okay. Folks that live on Cape Cod are probably very familiar with the early days of the lifeboat stations. There's some down in Chatham, Woods Hole, all along the coast, Provincetown, the whole 9 yards, lifeboat stations or life-saving service stations. And you can tell them because they typically are the little white buildings with the red roofs on them with maybe a lighthouse next door, right? That type of deal. The Revenue Cutter Service merged with the Life-Saving Service in 1932. And in 1939, we picked up those lighthouses. Okay, Boston Light, which is the only manned lighthouse left in the U.S., right? It's right in our back door in Boston Harbor. Okay, it's one of the Coast Guard's lighthouses. I think it's National Park Service now, but it was one of our original ones. (1942), now we're looking at the war years, 1942. Really, the Coast Guard was a major part of every single conflict since 1790, okay? World War II was also very big for us. I think there are some World War II vets in the audience, so thank you for your service. 1942 was also when Signalman First Class Douglas Munro was killed in action. Douglas Munro in Guadalcanal saved a group of Marines that were under heavy fire by the Japanese. Douglas Munro took his boat, used himself as a shield to get those Marines off, and he was killed in action. The only Medal of Honor recipient for the U.S. Coast Guard, Signalman First Class Munro. For a while, prior to where you see here it says 1967, where we moved the Department of Transportation. Originally, we were the Department of the Treasury. So it's kind of interesting with the Coast Guard. So we start off with the Department of the Treasury, right? It was Secretary Hamilton that created it. Then we move over to the Department of Transportation. Don't really know why that move ever happened, because when I joined in 1986, we were part of the Department of Treasury. And we were there for quite a while until 2001, when the World Trade Center terrorist attack took place. Okay? When that happened, the president, the country, felt that we needed to improve that homeland security, so they moved the United States Coast Guard as the largest component under DHS, and this is where we are today. We'll talk a little bit, when we talk more about the missions, I'll tell you a little bit more about how we responded during some of these events here. And then Homeland Security. Hurricane Katrina. That number up there, we saved 33,500 lives during Hurricane Katrina. That's a lot. That's the most in our history ever. And if you can think of that number, or remember that number in a little bit, or I'll remind you a little bit later, that's kind of an interesting number to have in your head. But we'll talk about that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a little video that's going to explain what the Coast Guard does, and then we'll get a little more details about that.
If you ask, what does the Coast Guard do? It's difficult to give just one answer.
When the seas are rough and the winds are harsh,
we surf. We rise.
We guard the nation's ports and waterways. We interdict. We seize.
We preserve the ocean's precious resources. We protect marine animals and their ecosystems.
We break the ice so that others may cross smoother paths.
We make sacrifices, but with honor, respect, and devotion to duty, we know our cause is worthwhile.
We train to stay ready, to defend our nation. We work as one team because we know that together we are unstoppable.
Every day, we reach out to those in need.
we save lives.
Since August 4th, 1790, we've answered the call.
We are the United States Coast Guard.
This is what we do.
Say, I'm going to sign up. That's pretty good. Whoops. That's so good, I'm going to watch it again. Yeah, we oversee 11 missions as codified in the Homeland Security Act of 2002. So there's two different breakdowns of our mission set. Top one there is the Homeland Security missions themselves, and then the non-Homeland Security missions. So we have the ports, waterways, and coastal security. We talked a little bit earlier when I was talking with you, Dave, about the Mississippi River. We have Coast Guard on the Mississippi River. River tenders and those waterways are just as vulnerable as any place else along the water, whether or not it's the ocean front or not. We do drug interdiction, migrant interdiction, defense readiness, and other law enforcement. For non-homeland security, marine safety, search and rescue, which is what we're most known for, search and rescue. Aids to navigation, living marine resources, environmental protection, and ice operations. Not a lot of people know about all these missions. Again, we tend to focus on the search and rescue, the law enforcement piece. Whenever you see a piece in on the news or something like that, we're saving somebody from the water, or you're seeing the helicopter fly over, right? Or we're interdicting some drugs, which we're really good at, by the way. We are experts in that field. Okay. So we are, in fact, also, during times of war, part of the Navy. The Coast Guard and the Navy, we interoperate very well. As a matter of fact, if it wasn't for the Navy, we couldn't do our mission. Okay. In a few seconds, and I think it's the next slide, we're going to talk about people, and I'm going to tell you why the Navy is so important at the Coast Guard. Okay. So let's take a look at the numbers real quick. Over here we have the Army. 471,000 active duty people in the Army. We have 325,000 active duty Navy members, 323,000 Air Force, 184,000 Marines, 42,000 Coast Guard. Okay. What's interesting about this number down here is there's 4 bars, but there's only 3 on the other services. We're the only military service that has a very strong auxiliary component. Okay. Our auxiliary, roughly 26,000 people, are volunteers. They wear Coast Guard blue as well, some slight variations. A lot of them have their own private watercraft. Some of them have their own private planes, and they fly missions for the U.S. Coast Guard. Okay. Why do they do that? Well, they love the Coast Guard. But number two, we've only got 42,000 people. Okay. Remember that number I said to remember, the 33,500 for Hurricane Katrina? We've only got 42,000 people. That's roughly one rescue per person for everybody in the Coast Guard. That's a significant amount. Now getting back to the Navy, why is the Navy important? We have a big mission set. We just looked at those 11 missions, which we're going to go into details here in a second. But how do we do all that, right? How do we do all that? The drug interdiction piece. The Coast Guard has of the authorities to interdict drugs on the high seas and make arrests. The armed forces, the other military branches cannot do that because they are Department of Defense. So you might have all the aircraft carriers in the world out there, but if I'm smuggling that cocaine, you can't touch me. Okay. However, if I put you four Coast Guard people on that aircraft carrier, right? Now we have this force multiplier. Now we can leverage our partners, our partnership with the U.S. Navy, put a few of our folks on there, and now we've just expanded our scope. So that's one of the ways that we get over that hurdle of not having enough people. So we use our friends, we use our partnerships. Okay. Oh, another number that people have always liked to throw out for years. Coast Guard folks, raise your hand in here. I don't know if you've ever heard this number here. Has anybody ever said that you guys are smaller than the New York City police force? Yeah, the 2014 numbers. Okay, now these are February 2018, so the number's a little higher, right? But according to the 2014 numbers, we had 36,000 active duty, so a little less than what you see here. And at the time, the New York City police force was 34,000. So almost spot on. Isn't that something? So where are we located? Let's talk about that. We are located all over the United States. We are up in the 1st Coast Guard District, up there in Boston. Right? So we take care of that area that's in yellow, probably over to about Albany or so in New York State. Below New York City, top end of New Jersey. So we have a district commander, and you're going to hear a message from him in a second. But we're spread out all over the place. District 8, by far the largest Coast Guard district, other than Alaska and Hawaii, right? They take care of all those central states. We have recruiting offices all over the place. We've got the Mississippi River. We've got inland waterways. We've got bridges. We've got ice operations. So those folks in the 8th district, not a lot of seacoast, but they got a pretty big mission. And I think if you notice down here, we've also got the Gulf of Mexico, and that, of course, is notorious for hurricanes. 7th District, nice and warm. 14th District, by far my favorite district. Okay. Alaska, Guam, Puerto Rico. Okay. So that's how we're distributed. But we go even further than that. Coast Guards, sometimes folks call us puddle jumpers, right? Right, we're shallow water sailors. But that's not true. The Coast Guard is worldwide. We've got folks right now in Bahrain. We've got Coast Guard cutters in Bahrain, in the Persian Gulf, helping to prevent terrorist activities. We've got boots on the ground in these locations. Okay? Standing right next to our coalition partners, standing right next to our other armed force brethren. And I haven't been to any of those places. 1st Coast Guard District, that's where we are right now. This is a very historic area, or a historic district. The 1st District is headquartered in the John Foster Williams building in downtown Boston. It's located right on Atlantic Avenue. John Foster Williams was the first revenue cutter commanding officer. He was on the USS Massachusetts, which was built in Newburyport. Okay. Because of that one simple fact, it makes the 1st Coast Guard District, where we all are right now, it makes it the birthplace of the Coast Guard. So it's a very historic area. Lexington is historic, got that, you know, but the Coast Guard, right? Newburyport, it's pretty good stuff. Okay. These pictures here are all from this part of the Coast Guard. Upper left-hand side, we have Air Station Cape Cod, an Air National Guard base down there. So we have some fixed wings and some helicopters. We've got what are called sector offices, so that's the operational component. It's kind of like any bureaucracy, you have to break it down, break it down, break it down. So our first Coast Guard district, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, Rhode Island, New York, Connecticut. I always forget about Connecticut for some reason. They don't do much down there, I guess. They're part of New Jersey. They're broken up into sectors. Sector Northern New England is located in Portland, Maine. Sector Southern New England is located in Woods Hole. We've got a sector right here in Boston to take care of local operations. We've got one in New York to take care of the ports of New York and New Jersey. Yes, sir.
Quick question. I'm a pilot, so I'm curious about what the range is on the helicopter.
That's a good question, and I don't know, but I can certainly find out if you want on a break. I'm not sure what the range is on those. I think that's a Jayhawk, I believe. Down here, we've got another one of our Whitehall. If you ever go down to Boston and you're right on the north end down there, you can see these ships tied up to the piers. These are the ones that do primarily the law enforcement activities. They also do the search and rescue, and they do operations in the northern Atlantic Ocean. Fisheries, things like that, to make sure that those folks that are fishing are correcting the right species and that they're not overfishing certain areas. Buoy tenders, those things are very clear from the color of their hulls. All our buoy tenders are black. And down in Weymouth, we actually have a buoy yard down there, which is kind of interesting. Also in this district is the mighty Coast Guard Cutter Eagle. If anybody's been in New London, Connecticut, and we're lucky enough to be in that area when the Eagle was in port, you get to see her. She's our only sailing vessel. She was a war prize during World War II from the Nazis. Okay. She is our Academy's training vessel. Every once in a while she pulls into Boston. Beautiful sight to see. You guys see the Constitution? You guys know where the Constitution is? Yeah, because our base is right across from that, and it's really, really quite an experience to see the Constitution over here and the Eagle over here. Beautiful. So now I do have another really short video. This is from Admiral T. Onson. He's the first Coast Guard District Commander, and his Command Master Chief Bill Hollingsworth.
I'm Rear Admiral Andy T. Onson, the new commander of the 1st Coast Guard District.
And I'm Master Chief Bill Hollingsworth, the Command Master Chief of the 1st District.
It is a true honor to serve as your district commander. I will work each and every day to support the men and women, active duty, reserve, civilian, and auxiliarist who make our 1st District great. Together, we will work to achieve the Commandant's vision of a ready, relevant, and responsive Coast Guard.
And our mission is to protect and defend life, property, and natural resources from northern New England to the metropolitan region of New York and New Jersey.
There's a rich maritime legacy here in the Northeast, and we will strive to uphold it by adhering to 3 guiding principles.
Leadership, establish what matters, set clear direction, and inspire others to accomplish more.
Proficiency, continuously pursue excellence in everything that we do, and exceed expectations as masters of our specialties.
Teamwork, embody our core values, cultivate positive command climates, and unconditionally help each other to achieve mission success.
As a Boston native, I couldn't be more proud to be back here in the Northeast. Together, we will cultivate a safe, secure, and environmentally responsible maritime community across this region. Thank you for your selfless service to our nation. Now, let's go do great things.
I will. So we have 5,500 active duty people spread across New England, right? Small boat stations, the air station that you saw, a picture of the aircraft there down on Cape Cod. The base itself, right? So I work at the base. Its job is to provide that logistical support for the operations side of it, right? Somebody's got to care and feed for those cutters when they get underway and help the families out as well. We're very, very good at doing that as well.
But really stretched.
Pardon me?
You're stretched.
We have enough to keep ourselves occupied, yes. So it's never a dull moment. I talked, and it's worth mentioning, you talk about the information technology degree that I have there. And one of the things that we're seeing in the Coast Guard now is this big shift towards cybersecurity. Right now I'm running over a network, I'm being broadcasted, recorded, where we have Wi-Fi here in the library that we can jump on, right? Somebody needs to manage all that, and historically, we don't do that. We go out and we save lives, we interdict drugs, we make sure that the migrants make it from Cuba or from wherever to the U.S. shore safely, or we return them, one of the two, right? That's what we do. So this whole cyber thing is a relatively new world, even the IT part of it, right? The computer side of it. Sure, we all have computers at home, I'm sure, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have known this was going on today, right? But who manages all that stuff, right? So the IT part of it's one thing, but now with the cyber business, with the hacking, right? Most of us, I'm sure, have gotten something from their bank saying, hey, you guys were hacked, here's your new debit card. I think we in California, we were getting them like once every couple months because Bank of America kept getting hacked. Somebody needs to protect the government. Somebody needs to protect the Coast Guard. Why is that? Because we have that sensitive data. We know where the drug smugglers are. We know where they're going to go. And the last thing we want to do is have somebody hack that, turn that over, and then the whole mission is blown, right? We don't want that. So let's talk a little bit about the missions. Port and waterway security. That's one of our missions. Okay. This, of course, from 9/11. And all the pictures you're going to see here are from the 1st District. I didn't pull any pictures from anywhere else, except for one, but I'll tell you what that is here. So when 9/11 hit, clearly it threw a lot of us, it threw a really big curve, something that we weren't expecting. And of all places where that's going to happen, it's going to happen in New York City, probably one of the more condensed areas on the East Coast. I remember where I was. I was down in the 1st Coast Guard District building. Right, this was a couple years before I met my wife. But I remember being called into the command center because they wanted me to see what was on television, and I'm standing there. I'm like, this is weird. It was surreal. It was surreal, right? I think a lot of people say when they remember Kennedy being shot, it was the same type situation. It's like, I'm not quite sure I'm hearing this, or I'm not quite sure I'm seeing this. So one of my jobs when I was down at that district building was to coordinate the resources to get them down to New York City. I never went to New York City. And to be honest with you, I think that would have been very difficult to do that. But my job at the time as a telecommunications manager was to get those resources down to New York City. Coast Guard worked nonstop. They took small boats like this. They found anything they could, went from Staten Island, which is where our Coast Guard base is down there, pulling people out of Manhattan. An amazing sight, an amazing thing, I am sure. Okay. Terrorism is an important and critical problem for all of us. It definitely is, again, for the Coast Guard, because one of our jobs is to retain the security of that port. Boston is a great example. If you ever sit there on the water side and you're watching these ships come in, some of the largest ships I've ever seen are liquid natural gas tankers. These LNG things are huge. Could you just imagine if a terrorist tried to blow up one of those things? Oh my God, it would be absolutely horrible, right? So we make it a point to get our stations out there. We work with local law enforcement, us, the police, the Maritime Environmental Protection folks go out there. We work as a team to make sure that these tankers get from where they are to where they need to be, and then out again safely. Okay. Drug interdiction. This photo was taken in 2017 on the Coast Guard cutter Tahoma, which is stationed in Kittery, Maine. Okay. In this particular picture, it says here that they confiscated approximately 3,130 kilograms of cocaine worth a street value of $90 million. So that must be what's in these little bins over here. And I've seen photos of other drug interdiction operators on some of our newer cutters that are 3 or 4 times that. Folks, we are making a difference. on that drug interdiction piece. Sometimes it doesn't seem like it because you watch the news and you see this bad stuff going on there. But I guarantee you that we have the knowledge, the wherewithal, and we have the drive to do things like this. This is just one small example of what these folks are doing every day. And it's dangerous. It's a dangerous job. Okay. Recently we had a case just here in the local area. Coast Guard Cutter Campbell, different cutter, same class, 210, 270 feet. They did a routine boarding, air quote that, a routine boarding. Didn't find anything, but this was a known bad actor. Okay. Didn't find anything, so the boarding crew left. The cutter's going to depart. That boat turned around and headed right for that cutter. They had every intention of ramming that ship. The good thing is that case is being processed in the court system, and my guess is this guy's going to go to jail for quite a while, right? It's a dangerous job. Migrant interdiction. This is a picture off the Coast Guard cutter Seneca, one of our Boston-based cutters. Not only do we get to enjoy the cold weather of the North Atlantic, every once in a while we say, hey guys, go ahead and go down to the Caribbean, and then we go down, we help out. We still have issues with folks trying to escape countries for whatever reason, whether or not it's political, whether or not it's economic, whether or not it's whatever, right? So our job is to help to make sure that those people that we do find are returned safely. Okay? It's not necessarily because we don't want to welcome folks into our country, although sometimes I think it is, right? It's just to make sure that these people are safe. Defense readiness. We do interoperate again with the U.S. Navy. When if war were to ever be declared again, we would immediately fall under the Navy. Okay, which is interesting because again, we're Department of Homeland Security, right? So we have this really weird dynamic. So we've got two sets of rules. We need to be able to protect you folks, so when you go down to Boston Harbor, you guys are safe. But on the same time, if anything bad were to happen, we got to be able to flip that switch and work with our friends in the Navy to make sure that we get the mission done. This here is a Flying Fish, one of our Boston-based cutters. She's 210 feet long. And then we do what they call other law enforcement. Those are other maritime operations. For example, if there's ever an air show, if you ever see an air show over the water, San Francisco is a great thing for that. San Francisco Bay, they have the Blue Angels fly over, right? They do all that kind of really cool stuff. One of our other law enforcement roles is to go out there and make sure that boaters don't go underneath falling planes, I guess. I don't know what you would want to call it. But the idea there is to create the security zone to make sure that folks that are interested in seeing something don't go too far to where they shouldn't be to put other people in danger. Okay. Interesting story about, let's see, that wouldn't fit under law enforcement. I'll tell you that story in a second. Marine safety. Pollution prevention, shipping safety. We do boardings. We want to make sure that your ship, when you're coming in from either another country or you're a U.S. flagged ship, that you're doing the right things, that you have the right paperwork, that you have the right safety gear, right? You know, make sure that you have the right number of life jackets, make sure you have the right number of escape vehicles if there is any on board, some of the larger cruise vessels and things like that. Okay, this here is a picture of our Boston-based Marine Safety Detachment working with Customs and Border Protection. Aids to navigation. Any of you guys sailors, you guys go out on the ocean for whatever reason, right? Buoys, things like that. Coast Guard takes care of all them as well. Now there's a small set that would be considered private, okay? But generally speaking, when you see some of the larger ocean-going size buoys, the Coast Guard takes care of that. We go out on our ships, we pull those buoys, we take them back, we clean them up, refurbish them down in Weymouth, paint them all up, take them back out, drop them back in. Continuous cycle. This was that one picture that isn't quite New England, although it does have an New England nexus. This was taken in Hawaii. We care about living marine resources. We will work with other organizations for things like sea turtles, for things like seals. Monk seals in Hawaii was a big one because they are an endangered species. Coast Guard will often lend our services to air certain creatures from point A to point B. Creatures is not really the right word for it, but the point is that we do a lot of this. Recently here in New England, because of the climate, because of the water temperature changes, there's been a particular endangered turtle species that have been washing up on the shores of Cape Cod. So what we're doing is we're helping to work with the local agencies to make sure that these animals are taken care of, and we will move them to a much warmer climate. Coast Guard does that as well. Environmental protection, that would include things like oil spills, things of that nature. Ice operations, that's one that most people don't know that we do. This is an ice-breaking tug. This is on the Hudson River. And we're coming up on ice season, so if you happen to be driving through the Hudson Valley, you're liable to see these things out there. It's really important because we have such a huge amount of our commerce is water-based, right? I mean, most everything comes from China these days, right? Whether that's Walmart, Target, some of those places, and these tankers, they bring all this product in, and if the waters become no longer navigable, then it affects our economy as well. So our icebreakers go out there and they clean everything up to allow these ships to come. All right, and then the last one, of course, is search and rescue. Okay, that's what we're known for. So let's finish up our story here. It was during the wee hours of the morning on April 18th, I returned to the communication station in Marshfield. Although I had prayed the night before, the crew of the Star of Alexandria was still missing. I felt like somebody punched me in the gut. As the morning waned, it wasn't looking good, but I still held hope. The Coast Guard has always persevered. By noon that day, an Air Station Cape Cod jet and Air Station Elizabeth City C-130 spotted a tiny life raft. The C-130 dropped a radio, and in Boston, we all held our breath. This case taught me some valuable lessons that I'd like to share with you today. First, I learned that accuracy above all else is paramount. The Star of Alexandria had only one opportunity to send a distress call. If it hadn't been for my 500 kilohertz operator accurately recording that single call, our assets may have looked in the wrong location. Second, your Coast Guard men and women, regardless of rank or rate, are the voices of the Coast Guard for the maritime community. Speaking is essential, but listening even more so. Third, I learned that the value I bring to the Coast Guard rests solely with me, just as it does for each Coast Guard employee. It is incumbent upon us to learn everything we can about our jobs and strive to be the expert. We ask questions of our peers, our supervisors, and our commands. We practice our trade. We become proficient in our technologies, our processes, and our procedures. Fourth, I learned that it's okay to be afraid. When Petty Officer Morin told me he copied a true-to-life distress call, my first thought was, now what do I do? I could have panicked, but instead I relied on my training. I relied on what I had learned from other folks. Each one of us has been trained like that, and we rely on that. Many would think that we were lucky that day when the radio fell beside that tiny life raft. An arm reached out and grabbed it. So 23 of the 25 crew members aboard the Star of Alexandria lived to tell their story. But it wasn't luck. It was a culmination of the training, our diligence, our perseverance, and above all, a manifestation of our core values of honor, respect, and devotion to duty. Thank you very much. I did have one really quick thing I want to add real quick, Linda.
Sure.
It's just one story I wanted to tell you. I missed it up in the beginning. When I was, let's go back a few slides here. Let me show you this here. Let's go back to that one there. Okay. So 9th Coast Guard District's up here. That's the Great Lakes area. And if you remember on that second slide, third slide I showed, I was in Buffalo, New York. Well, so I was in communications. I was a prior enlisted radioman in the Coast Guard. So one of my jobs was listening to the radio, responding to distress calls. And we got this call, I don't know if it was in the spring or fall, but it was before winter because the lake hadn't frozen over yet. And it was a guy in a houseboat saying he was lost. He was transiting the Erie Canal on this houseboat, and he suddenly got disoriented. And he's like, you know, what do I do? So he called Coast Guard up, right? I said, where are you? He took a right and not a left. And when you take a right out of the Erie Canal, where are you headed towards? Freaking Niagara Falls. So anyway, I just want to throw that out there.
Okay, so let's have some questions. Okay, let's first you, then I'll be right back to you.
When did that
you
international
use the mic?
thing, Red Stripe?
The year for the Red Stripe. That's
The
what you're
International Red Stripe, yeah.
Right.
You all have it, right?
Yep, that was in 1967. That's when the racing stripe first came to be. And the funny thing about that is if you look at most other national Coast Guards, whether or not it's the Japanese, the Canadians, the Philippines, they all have a racing stripe. And they all got that idea from us because that's one common denominator. If you see a ship with a racing stripe on it like that, majority of the time it's going to be a life-saving service. So.
Hi, my name is Steve Whiteman. I have two questions.
Sure.
One, it's a relatively easy one for you, I'm sure, is the Coast Guard Auxiliary and the Coast Guard. Could Coast Guard function without the Coast Guard Auxiliary, considering that high ratio, that's about 60-something% support that the Coast Guard gets is from the Coast Guard Auxiliary. That's one. And two, American Samoa, is there Coast Guard there? Because there's a huge national park there. So I'm just curious about that too.
Yeah, okay, so the first question is, could the Coast Guard operate or function without the Coast Guard Auxiliary? And I would say we probably could. However, we would probably have a lot more boating accidents, right? We'd have a lot more mystery about what the Coast Guard does. We wouldn't be able to augment a lot of the programs that we currently have that we rely on them for, right? A good example, recently we had to rely on the auxiliary to come in to provide some security services because the contract that we had expired. So we brought the auxiliary in to make sure that our base was safe, right? Could we have operated without them? Yes. But would it have been as effective? Absolutely not. You know,
The Coast Guard Auxiliary has pilots too.
they do.
Right.
Right. Oh yeah, for the air patrol and all this other stuff. Yeah, they provide an invaluable service. They will go out there and augment our aircraft as well. So we might fly a Coast Guard C-130 one day and a local auxiliary aircraft another day. So it's a hard question to answer.
It'd be like working with one arm.
Well, it absolutely would. I mean, they really are that essential. And then your second question was American Samoa. I got the fortunate opportunity once to fly a Coast Guard C-130, 11 hours from Honolulu to American Samoa. And I can tell you that there is a small Coast Guard unit down there, yes. Yeah. Yeah.
That was a privilege.
What's that?
11 hours?
Yeah. Very long flight. Back of the plane.
You mentioned the turtles and the warming waters off of Cape Cod. What other kind of changes is the Coast Guard seeing with the climate?
Well, I think, I'm not an expert in that particular subject, but I do know that a majority of our units are right at the water line, right? Whether or not it's here in New England, like Chatham or places like that. San Francisco Bay, we were stationed out there, and of course Hawaii is another one. My wife and I were stationed out there in Hawaii. I think that the climate changes themselves will have a significant impact over time for a lot of these locations. We're going to have to probably move or reconstruct or do something. Or if anything, just moving the ships to make sure that the piers are suitable for maybe rising water levels. As far as the environmental protection side of it or the living marine resources side. I don't have too much data about that. But the sea turtles are the one that stand out because this is not the first year that this has happened. This has happened a couple of years before as well. So I wish I could give you more information, but that's about all I know. So.
I've got two questions for you. One on search and rescue. How often does it happen that the boat that's in danger, the skipper is not in a position to radio you, and it's a passenger not familiar with the electronics and so does not give you a good position? And then how do you deal with that? And the other is on the natural gas ships coming into Boston Harbor. Are we setting up offshore facilities now to unload the gas offshore?
Yeah, the answer to the second one is not that I'm aware of. I mean, the way my office sits right downtown there, I can see these things come in, so I don't think that there's any offshore mechanism at present. So it will be every single time a ship comes in, is a risk assessment that has to take place, right, to make sure that we have the right resources in place to ensure the safety, to make sure that there's no competing traffic and things like that. But they're still making their way in. So, and then the first part of the question was about the, let's say you have a ship that's in distress, the captain of the vessel can't radio, crew members might have difficulty doing it, right, that type of thing. Is that the gist of what you were asking? Well, in 1984, 85, when I joined, they would have been screwed, bottom line. I mean, really, when you think about it. Well before the days of the satellite systems. Today we're fortunate because with satellites in the air and the technology we have in place, you really don't even have to use the radio much. We know where you are. We know exactly where you are, right? So if there is a distress and we know you're in distress, we will have the data to find out where you were headed, and it'll give us a really, really good idea of where you probably sank, right? That's assuming that we know that you sank to begin with, right? But we have computer systems that monitor and manage all of that stuff. So then it just becomes figuring out which assets that we need to get out there to look, and then we work with our partners. A lot of times we do work with the Navy. We get their aircraft to get out there to help us augment as well. And then we have better luck finding. Is it a perfect system? No, but we're pretty successful for that.
I can see where that happens for commercial vessels. Is that true for two guys on a sailboat?
Probably not, probably not. So really then it becomes last known position, right? That's why it's really important. It's one of the things that our auxiliary workforce comes into play, right? If it's a recreational craft, whether or not it's a sailboat or just a small motorboat, is always file that sail plan. You know, when were you going to leave? When should we anticipate your arrival? And what course are you going to take, right? If you stick with the plan and something happens, there's a better chance we're going to find you, right? If you decide to go rogue, then it becomes very, very complicated, really fast. So.
Does that happen often?
It probably happens more often than we would like. But I think that recreational boaters specifically are becoming much smarter than they were, except on the Great Lakes. Horrible on the Great Lakes. But most, and actually I laugh but it's true. Recreational boaters on the Great Lakes tend to drink more, right? I don't know why that is. Maybe it's because it's cold on Lake Erie, I don't know. But their sailing habits on the Great Lakes tend to be a little less robust than what they would be if they were doing an ocean voyage. So.
Okay, so this over here.
Commander.
Then we're going to move over to this side of the room for
Yes, sir.
Tom. Okay, go.
Is there anything they can do to catch and penalize the people that call in the false distress calls to the Coast Guard?
If we're able to track back, then yes, we absolutely can, and we have, right? But a lot of times we just don't. We're just not able to track it all the way back. Because really, the problem is with calling in a false distress call specifically. It's not only the fact that you're putting our people at risk, because if it's something that, for example, requires an aircraft, you're putting a whole aircraft, a whole airframe at risk. Every time a plane takes off, for Pete's sake, it's risky. Those things shouldn't be flying. They're made of metal, for God's sakes, right? But every time we do that, and then a lot of times it's in bad weather. So now not only are you putting the crew and the aircraft at risk, you're throwing them through bad weather here for what? For nothing, because somebody was messing around. But we will prosecute if we can figure out who did that. I mean, there's been cases. Remember there for a while people were pointing green lasers at aircraft?
Yes.
Yeah, Hawaii, it was a big thing, because at Barber's Point there, what was happening is that the C-130s would take off for either routine patrols or search and rescue operations, and somebody was flashing green at them, you know? So we find out who you are, we will prosecute. Sorry, man, shouldn't have done it.
Let the dogs loose.
What's that?
Let the dogs loose.
Let the dogs loose, yeah.
Okay, next.
Commander, may I ask, specifically, what was the role of the Coast Guard in the Vietnam conflict and more generally in the Cold War?
Okay, well, the Cold War piece, I would imagine, and I can't speak specifically to the Cold War. I know that Vietnam, we had patrols over there just like everybody else. We had the, you know, we would take like the Higginson boats. We were, matter of fact, Monroe, no, that was World War II. Vietnam War. We had the patrol boats over there because at the time they were painted white. They didn't have the racing stripe, right? We were in all the different areas. I mean, I can't think of anything specific though off the top of my head because I'm not a Vietnam War era up to speed on that particular area. But it's definitely worth looking into because I think that we, like I said, we played an active role in everything. Yes, sir.
The Coast Guard patrols some of the rivers in Vietnam.
There we go. So river patrols, great. Thank you.
Okay, next one right over here.
And you talked about cybersecurity. It just so happens my oldest grandson is a cybersecurity major down at Stevens Institute in New Jersey. So schools are starting to get that major. It's so important.
Right, it is, and I think where we see the big gap now, I think for our internal networks, we're moving ahead leaps and bounds. Where I think we still have some gaps is with our port partners, Port of Boston, for example, right? You know, you pick any shipping company, if they don't have good security and they interface with us at some point on the IT side, now we're at risk, right? So it's that continual engagement, because the stuff is expensive. Cybersecurity is expensive. Any IT system is expensive. You know, there's nothing you can do about that. It's just the way things are. So the question becomes, how do you balance what you do have, your systems, make sure that you get the right protections in place so that nothing bad happens. So far, nothing bad has happened, right? So we are on top of it. We've got cryptological units. We've got experts in that field right now that are doing their best. Matter of fact, we're looking at realigning some of our business processes in the Coast Guard to be able to support that cybersecurity aspect. So we're definitely headed in the right direction. Yes, sir. Jim.
Well, how were the 23 crew members actually rescued? I mean, you found them on the boat, or they were on the small boat.
We did, yep.
I mean, how were they saved?
They were saved by the Ravenscraig, because in the beginning of the story, we have a system in place that actually, if you're an ocean-going vessel, boy, this is going to stretch my memory back a little bit. Very good. It's the International Maritime Organization, IMO. Does that sound familiar? If it doesn't, that means I can continue talking about it because you have no idea what I'm talking about. No, it's the International Maritime Organization, I believe it is, that has a safety of life at sea, SOLAS. Basically, it's the international rules of the high seas. So if I'm a flag vessel for Bahamas, no, that would be a cruise ship. All right, how about Guatemala? Okay, I'm a Guatemalan ship, and I hear a distress call. I'm obligated by these international rules to divert and assist. If I don't, there's going to be some kind of punishment, as it were, right, by the international community. So for the Star of Alexandria, we had used the system, contacted the Ravenscraig, that was maybe 4 or 5. It was the only vessel in that area, as a matter of fact. So she diverted to assist. In the meantime, we used our aircraft to vector in on their last known position, the one that my colleague there copied, and that's when we saw the life raft. So the Ravenscraig ended up picking up. As a matter of fact, I think if you read through the article, which I flashed on there really quick, it does say that in there. So that's a great example of how, again, one guy sitting in one little glass booth listening to dots and dashes picked this thing up, and because of that, we were able to get not only the Coast Guard and the Navy resources out there, but we were also able to get a Good Samaritan by to save these people's lives. And that's a really good example of how we all can work together to save lives.
Great story.
You're on.
Oh, yes, sir.
Would you put that mic next to your mouth?
Like this?
Perfect.
You look around the room, and this might be right or wrong, but most of us aren't familiar with cybersecurity.
Right.
So probably you find a lot of people in here who know how to use a sextant. They know what LORAN is.
Right.
They know all those things. But those have been kind of pushed aside, and it goes into the CIC, which has maybe a couple of people. But they're counting on accurate information coming from the satellite or being read. And we saw those 2 destroyers in the Sea of Japan, which clearly didn't know where they were. And I mean, I don't think they had any sextants. So it's you have the IT job. Yeah. You have the hardest job I can imagine.
Yeah, yeah. It's right. Well, all right. I'm not that old, but I'm getting older. But I mean, I remember. I'm gonna look back on it like I'm a grandfather. I remember the good old days in the Coast Guard, right? In 1984, when I joined, and I could still have a beard, right? I got rid of that in 1985 after I was in for about a year. But in the old days, we navigated using things like sextants. Actually, I think sextants were almost the backup. I think we had like LORAN, systems like that to help us navigate, right? A lot of it was high frequency based, HF type communications. A lot of it was maneuvering boards, paper, doing dead reckoning type things when you're in close to shore. We have moved away from that, and now we're using these electronic based systems. And if you've ever turned on your home computer and something weird happened with it, that happens also with this new technology stuff right now. I can't necessarily speak to the collision that you're referring to because I wasn't following that too closely. But I will say that that is a big concern. We are becoming more and more reliant on technology. Does everybody here have a cell phone? I'm just curious. Does anybody not have a cell phone in the room? Right? So we're headed in that direction. And there is a risk with that, and that's why that cyber piece is so important, because it would be really easy, and I think we've seen that in movies over the last few years or so, where these adversarial people will hack into your network and do something like this, and I think it was some James Bond film there for a while, I think, talked about that, right? And you've got things going all over running into each other. It's very real. It's a very real concern, But I assure you that not only us, but the Department of Defense specifically are really putting their best foot forward to trying to solve these problems, which is why the Coast Guard's putting a lot of their efforts on cybersecurity. Very small workforce. I think at one point I saw with the Navy, or was it the Army, one of those 2 services had like 40,000 cybersecurity experts, and we had 19. Right? True story.
Okay, we're going to wrap up with a couple of more questions. We have one here, and then the gentleman in the blue jacket.
Thank you. I wonder if you could comment on the design of Coast Guard cutters. They must be designed to be buoyant and powerful in very, very heavy seas.
Right. I'm an IT guy, not an engineer. But as you're alluding to, each of the class of cutters does have to be designed different, right? We have right now 2 heavy icebreakers. You guys know that we have icebreakers in the Coast Guard. They're very obvious by their color. Red, right? Yeah, we have 2. We have the Coast Guard cutter Healy and the Coast Guard cutter Polar Star. We've only got 2. I think the Russians have a huge fleet, right?
Russians have bunches.
Yeah, they do, and they're all nuclear powered. They're like really cool. We run them on like old diesel engines or something like that. So those things obviously have the double hulls, right? They're meant to lift up on the ice, crack them, and stuff like that. We've got the buoy tenders, which is a different design, right? The buoy tenders, the black boats, they need to lift up these heavy buoys, throw them on deck, and not have the boat tip over backwards, so a different design, right? And then we have our endurance cutters, right? Our national security cutters, 419 foot. Those are our newest class of ships. They can go out for periods of up to 100. Actually, they're designed for 220 days out of the year underway, right? I do not want to volunteer to be on that boat. It's a very long time to be gone.
Where do they meet?
What's that?
Where they meet?
Bollinger. They're Bollinger. That's where I believe we got that group of cutters from. Don't hold me to that. We can look that up if you want afterwards. I think that sounds right.
Can you comment on the presence of the Coast Guard in the U.S. Virgin Islands?
Well, it's a U.S. territory, which suggests we have Coast Guard down there. I'm trying to think if I know of any station down there in the Virgin Islands. What's that? I'm not quite sure if we have a station down there. Not that I'm familiar with. I'll be honest with you, I'm not a West Coast Atlantic or Western Atlantic, Southern Atlantic sailor. I'm not even sure if I know that terrain. Where are they at? Where's the closest?
Probably Miami.
Okay. Then probably not. What's that?
San Juan.
Yeah, okay, there you go. If they're near San Juan, there, because we do have a base. Matter of fact, they're just creating a new base in San Juan right now. So they would be covered by Sector San Juan and Sector Miami. Charlotte, Amali?
Yeah, that's the main, it's the main city.
Okay, that's where there's a Coast Guard station.
Okay.
Thank you, Google.
Well, all good things must come to an end. I know there's more questions, but George Burnell is going to have the final word because he tells me he has a personal Coast Guard story that he would like to tell, and it sounds like it's going to be a wonderful way to wrap up this afternoon. George, tell us.
That's oversold. I just want to extend you a thank you and the Coast Guard a thank you. We struck a rock off the Brewsters in Boston Harbor and had the pleasure of getting towed in by the Coast Guard. 20 years later, I was not on board, but the boat I now own had cargo shift, broke a hose loose, was sinking in Vineyard Sound, and the Coast Guard towed the boat into safety. And that's the kind of thing you do. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
So, now we know.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Now we know what a great job the Coast Guard does for us. Just one more sec, I'll close out the program. Want to wish everybody a marvelous holiday season and a happy new year. Our next program is January 14. Please be here, bring some goodies for the veterans at the Bedford Green. And the program will be how Abraham Lincoln came to write the Gettysburg Address. Complete change will be land-bound. No more boats for a while. Thank you again, Commander Cole. See you all next week. Bye.